먹었어요.
백선학 선생님,
백영선 선생님. 고현희 선생님 무슨 부탁 말씀하실 게 있으세요?
내가 그래서 연습해보자고 그렇게 부탁했던 것만 연습할 기회를 주지 않아서 나를 그렇게 망신을 주다니, 소정쌤. 근데 여기
망신
밑에
주다니
공유라고
무슨
있어.
네?
어? 공유가 있어. 공유를 누르면 맨
아,
밑에 음소거 비데오 시장 옆에 공유 있죠?
네네.
그거를 누르고 이제 들어가면 돼.
선생님 공유 누르시면 안 되죠. 선생님은 이제 아까 공유하실 때
근데 내가 또
공유했다는
만들어서 근데 내가 또 PPT를 만들어서 답을
예.
하려고.
알겠어요. 그 사이에 세상에
오,
공유를
공유를
누르시고요. 예. 공유를 누르시고
들어와서
마지막에 지금 해보시려고요? 이제 시작해야
한번
되는데
해볼게요. 나 아까 끝까지 못 내렸어요.
그래서 제가 내려드렸잖아요. 혹시 못하시면 제가 내려드릴게요.
아, 내려줄 수 있어요?
아까
그럼
그래서
올리는
제가
것만 내가 올릴 테니까 내려줘요.
근데 내리는 걸 가르쳐 드릴게요. 좀 이따. 근데 해보시고 안 되면 이제 아까처럼 제가 내려드릴게요.
자, 올려볼게 한번.
지금?
이렇게 올렸어요. 올라갔어요?
네,
네.
올라갔고요.
그 다음에
저
어떻게 내려요?
지금 올리신 자리에 보면 그 위로 가서 보면 저희가
공유가
내려와요.
있어요.
그러니까 선생님이 올리신 그 화면에 보면은 거기에 펑션 키 같은 게 보인다니까요. 테이프 내려온다고. 보이세요?
그게 안
위쪽으로
보이네.
가보세요. 선생님 커서를. 그러면은 공유된 그 화면 위쪽에 저희 배너 같은 게 내려와요. 펑션 뭐라고 그래야 돼? 그 테이프 내려온다니까.
그래,
거기에
그렇다.
공유
네네.
중지가 있어.
퍼센트 공유.
위로
웹브라우저
올라가세요.
더 위로?
그 위쪽으로 올라가 보세요.
여기.
그러면 거기.
오케이,
거기
땡큐.
공유 중지
네, 됐어요. 됐어. 증지했어요.
잘하셨어요.
네.
그 조금 약간 시간 기다려야 될 것 같은데요. 그죠? 다 안 들어오셔가지고.
Okay. Then I think Nikki is here because Nikki arrived a little bit late just before because she has yeah, she has a class in the morning. So Nikki joined like later. So I'd like to introduce it's not my PhD students, but it's PhD students in my college, and she really helped out a lot of preparation of workshop. Please, Nikki.
Hello everyone, my name is Nikki. I'm from Hungary and I'm studying at Songkyunkwan University. I'm doing my PhD at Confucian Studies, but my research interest is mainly Korean Neo-Confucianism. Yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Shall we start or wait a little bit more?
Rather than just waiting in silence, I think I'd better to say something about my apology first, because I'm really sorry for giving you a half-done paper, and I found that it was not really what I can do, both hosting the meeting and preparing my own presentation. So that's why I couldn't finish my paper. But as I've received Sarah's comment paper, I found that actually Sarah, as if Sarah has already read the second half of my paper, which was not written yet. So that's why I hope after my presentation, you can get more understanding through Sarah's comment paper. So I think not all of them, all of the audience here, but maybe. Okay, yes, right. Yeah, I know that you are in the very late time now. So anyway, I would like to, yeah, one more kind of excuses, additional excuses. As I wrote this paper, I have found, I have felt once again how difficult this topic is, because I should have like summarize different conceptual history of China, Japan, and Korea in modern times, and I should compare all these things regarding Jaeon, because as you know, as you may know, the concept of Jaeon originated from the Lao Tzu, but actually its conceptual history in East Asian country are not exactly the same. So, and then I should explain the concept also is kind of my theory I have written in another paper, and this is not kind of my claim is like philosophizing in East Asia is different from the Western philosophizing, and they philosophize a concept through clustering the concept, something like that. So it is a kind of complicated idea. And then I aim to do some case study, how to connect, to connect the traditional concept of Jaeon to contemporary art and the contemporary use of like Jaeon, in some certain phrases, contradictory structured phrases hidden behind those kind of expressions, something like that. Anyway, I haven't complete all this my job yet, but I hope I can convey what I was trying to do. Okay, I think not all participants here, but I think enough number of participants is here, so I do not want to spend more time for apologizing. I'll directly read my paper. Let me begin with whether it is appropriate to talk about Korean beauty in this global era. Aesthetic norms, which seems to be generally agreed upon, say that judgment about beauty should be communicated universally. Of course, this means subjective universal communicability. You may not consider what everyone else thinks beautiful as beautiful. Some may even think that aesthetic tastes are completely personal and they cannot claim any universality. However, we largely agree that we have a common ground or common sense to discern beauty, even though there may be a variety of personal tastes. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be able to seek consent from others for our sense of aesthetics. In other words, I may not like what other people like, but I can understand why they like it, and vice versa, they can understand why I don't like it, while seeking my consent for what they like. Even if considering that aesthetic taste can be both universal and subjective, the word Korean beauty may still sound strange. This is because it sounds as if beauty has nationality. Does it mean the beauty of Korean-made works or the Korean kind of beauty of Korea as a country? Or does it mean that there is a unique beauty that Koreans authentically like? In this global era, culture and arts of other countries are popular in Korea, and Korean arts and culture are also enjoyed in other countries. According to the aforementioned subjective universality, not everyone likes Korean culture and arts, but Korean culture and art, especially popular culture and arts, are loved by people all over the world now. Then, in the expression of Korean beauty, does Korean mean nationality? To say that a Korean-made piece of artwork is different from saying that the work has Korean characteristics. Korean contemporary artists can work in the style of Western contemporary art, and we do not bother to find something that can be called Korean beauty in their works. Then you may think that the quest for Korean beauty is nothing more than an unnecessary nationalistic approach to subjective universal works. However, this topic was not initiated by any Korean nationalist at the beginning. Ironically, the academic discourse on Korean beauty began with non-Korean scholars when Korea was not a sovereign state, when they lost their right to, sovereign state. Although the nationalist perspective may or might gradually have been included in the discussions that continued later on, it was not. It was actually rather meaning that the discourse of Korean beauty discourse was rather kind of discovery that the idea of, I will say, put in other words, it was rather close to a discovery that the idea of Korean beauty was first conceived. Losing sovereignty, Koreans devoted themselves to political resistance and could not afford to recognize and conceptualize Korean beauty at all. Early scholars trying to talk about Korean beauty seems to be obsessed by the notion of natureness or nature, which was marked as a 자연 in Korean. As discussed later, the meaning of the two concepts, natureness or nature and 자연, are not completely consistent, but they are used interchangeably in Korea today. If you are familiar with the basic ideas of the modern aesthetic theory, you will probably be wondering why the concept of naturalness is so persistently implicated in attempt to conceptualize beauty in Korea. In the early discourse of Korean beauty, however, both domestic and foreign scholars shared a deep understanding of Korean art and culture and crafts, despite different academic background and writing motifs. They have come to the concept of 자연 or naturalness as if agreed in advance. Yanagi, who is the Japanese scholar, Japanese thinker and art critic, he says that, quote, a return to nature, 시즌, the law of great art, is taking place, end of quote, in Joseon ceramics. He seems to contrast 시즌 with nature with artificial, but this does not dichotomously treat nature as a nature object outside. Rather, he calls it 시즌 in the sense that 시즌, like nature, the 시즌 in Japanese, in the sense that the artistic achievement has reached its peak and is no longer considered human. Also, he says that nature, human emotion, 시즌과 인조, are close to the essence of truth, and the human emotions are based on nature, 시즌. So for him, on nature, 후시젠나 or 후시젠사 unnaturalness mean let's say undesirable trend in reality. In nature, 시젠나 or 시젠사 means the ideal state in which we should be. He declares, quote, everyone's heart mind wants to return to nature, end of quote. And another quote, rebellion against nature is rebellion against beauty, end of quote. Another foreign scholar who was like German missionary, Eckhart, deems that Korean has natural taste for the beautiful. He compared Korean art to neighboring countries, China and Japan, and described as follows. If China was the teacher of Far East Asian art, Korea was a student who further ennobled what she has learned, while Japan was a doctoral pupil of China and Korea. He says that taste for deformity, quote, quote, deformities as an ideal of beauty, end of quote, found in the two neighboring countries are entirely foreign to Korea, because Koreans have kept their, quote, nature artistic sense and taste, end of quote. He often uses the word nature, but the natural taste he found in Korean art is close to the meaning of an innate sense of classical beauty found in ancient Greek art. So he says that Korean aesthetics is familiar with canons of art and numerical proportion. If you are familiar with expressions such as non-uniformity or asymmetry or spontaneity or unfinishedness, etc., that are often mentioned about characteristics of Korean art, we may feel it is a little bizarre for Eckhart to evaluate Korean art in general as classical, meaning the norm of beauty based on numerical harmony. However, Yanagi, the previous Japanese scholar, who provided the prototype of such expressions, asymmetry, non-humanity, or spontaneity, etc., was also fully aware that Korean artists were able to create works like Seokguram, which is a stone grotto of the temple, which is quite famous heritage of Silla period, with a unified structure with an accurate sense of unity and proportion. Therefore, the idea of perfect proportions and pursuit of spontaneity, which seems contradictory in language, may not be contradictory in the actual artwork. In fact, I believe that these complex intentions always occur in real artwork. The work that is made to fit the exactly calculated form is not already a work of art, but a ready-made product. You will find works that have reached the climax of mathematical harmony in Korean art, or at reach the highest peak of delicacy, but you will also find works that are innocent like children, or even seeming unfinished. Of course, this depends on the choice of the artist or artisan, but it seems that early aestheticians did not see these two features as incompatible contradictions. A clue to this can be found in Yanagi's word, quote, "There are many works in Joseon's art that cannot be convinced by human judgment. Anything humans do end up fitting into a certain style. However, Jaehyun's work, but he expressed, of course, shizen in Japanese. Sorry. I read different line. However, Joseon Korean work, is made so that it is impossible to know whether it is human or nature. To say that art, which can only be human act, pursue nature, 자연, or shizen in Japanese, has already implied a linguistic contradiction. In this context, art can be said to be pursued somewhere in between human and nature beyond its dichotomy. The third thinker I would like to introduce is Korean one. So he's a later generation. His name is Go Yu-seop. His pen name is Woo-hyun. I will talk about that later on. So Go Yu-seop, it was Go Yu-seop who actively conceptualized the aesthetic predicates of Korean beauty through combining contradictory vocabulary on the basis of his contemplation on such conflicting concepts contained in the expressions presented by those who have found irreplaceable beauty in Korean art. His contribution to Korean aesthetics is deep and wide, but here I would let me just have a look at the creation of explaining the characteristic of Korean beauty in a contradictory structure. He grasped the structural features of its aesthetics experience as a structure that aims for a new synthesis by combining paradoxical or contradictory properties into one. And through this, he coined expressions that represent the unique aesthetic beauty of Korean art. For example, expressions such as freeness without freeness and unplanned plans, etc. There are a lot more. I believe he invented those oxymoron or contradictory expressions not simply as a rhetorical device to reveal the limit of language, but rather as an active expression to reveal the artistic ideas of Koreans. Seen from her pen name, Woo Hyun. Woo Hyun comes from Xuan Zhi You Xuan in the Lao Tzu. You may know the chapter 1. So he took us a part of part of the concept of Lao Tzu to make his pen name. It seems that he was familiar with Taoist terms and Taoist types of contradictory coinage as well. In addition to the expressions such as unplanned plan, made in a way that repeatedly denies the same word. But not only that, he also used very colloquial, very Korean vernacular words like connotative qualities to express the contradictory structure of Korean beauty. For example, 저교한 유머, which means quiet and serene humor, and 어른 같은 아해, a grown-up child. Of course, a grown-up child is quite familiar to us in English-speaking word, but it was quite like creative, like coinage at the time. He not only creates these expressions, but also analyze that contradictory traits such as serenity, 덕요, and cheerfulness, 명랑, make them coexist simultaneously and combine together. One of the reasons his research is considered to be more advanced than that of previous foreign scholars is that he has unearthed, digged and unearthed or excavate vivid expressions that could possibly be conveyed only in Korean. It is hard to properly convey the nuances of the expression he created using the linguistic sense of Korean. For example, like 구수한 큰맛. 구수한 큰맛 can be literally rendered into savory big taste. However, when Korean hear the sound of 구수한 here, not 고소한, instead of thinking of the salty taste or spicy taste of food, they will most probably immediately come up with a kind of taste that brings us generosity or tolerance, because it is pronounced in inbo, u. That means the 구수한 taste of inbo feels bigger and heavier and wider than the 고소한 taste of 양보. So that is very, very Korean. So although he sometimes describes the characteristic of Korean art using negative phrases such as indifference or non-uniformity or unrefinedness, etc., but these concepts are not presented as the ultimate goal of Korean art, but rather the characteristics revealed in dynamic concepts are what he really wanted to convey. So this person, 고유섭 Woo Hyun, tried to express Korean beauty in his own way by revising various expressions without repeating the word 자연. So he didn't talk about 자연 that much, but later aestheticians and art critics or art historians, they often encapsulate his whole ideas as a naturalism, 자연주의. They responded to Woo Hyun's claim is kind of talking about 자연 in Korean. The representative person who interpreted him in that way is Kim Won-young. Unfortunately, although this Kim Won-young claimed to inherit Woo Hyun, 고유섭, he missed out the implication of Woo Hyun's contradictory phrases and placed naturalism with idealism as opposing ones. In this way, actually the later one, Kim, theorized Korean naturalism as a subfield of general naturalism. As a result, the concept of 자연, which was employed to describe Korean beauty, came to be considered somewhat a very static one. And Do Yo-han, another aesthetician and philosopher, compiles the Korean beauty discourse in the early 20th century. It has focused mainly on visual art, and then expand the scope of this discourse by applying it to other fields, such as literature, music, and garden and architecture. Furthermore, he argues that in addition to the influence of imported traditions, such as Buddhism and Confucianism from China, he highlight shamanism. He believed shamanism served as a hidden background for shaping the characteristic of Korean beauty. His comprehensive explanation helps us a lot to understand the discourse of Korean beauty so far, but it is not philosophically robust, I think, because this so-called shamanistic character is clearly characteristic of Korean identity, I guess. That we should keep in mind that aspect. However, the ideological characteristic of shamanism itself are not well defined. As a result, and then the explanation of how it has developed, how it has transformed while coexisting with it with other traditions is not clear. Of course, criticism of the Korean beauty discourse has also been raised early on. Those like Dietrich, that another German scholar, showed reluctance to generalize the aesthetic sense of various Korean artworks, but he also acknowledged fantastic and playful strain that reminds us of the concept of Jaeon, as I mentioned. More recently, one of Korean contemporary artists, I would like to skip this part because there has been a kind of sharp criticism on this kind of the Korean beauty discourse, but this discourse has been sustained and many people come back to this discourse, and this is problematic in the field of Korean aesthetics. Okay, so ironically, even though there is those kind of criticism, to me, this is very, how to say, misleading criticism. Ironically, this kind of sharp responses show how repetitive this giant discourse about Korean beauty is taking place until today, and how dogmatically infused it is, stifling the contemporary artist. In sum, the concept of Jaeon is still regarded as a powerful answer to characteristics of Korean beauty. The problem is that the understanding of Jaeon, which has a complex and dynamic concept, has been further reduced and regressed rather than the early inquiry. There is no more advanced discussion than before, and only returning to initial discussion occurs repeatedly, making a boring, familiar story to Koreans. Why does this early discourse on Korean beauty remain influential until now, and why are we failing to deepen the concept of Jaeon? I believe that tracing the history of Jaeon as a modern concept will provide clues to answer to this question. So far, actually, I just show the problems, but I didn't provide answer yet. But my unplanned plan or planned I don't know. I planned, but I haven't achieved. So unfinished plan is I would like to analyze the East Asian concept of Jaeon. So how they were kind of estranged from the traditional concept of Jaeon by modern translation of nature to 시젠,自然, and Jaeon in modern period. So I'd like to show that, and nevertheless, not all the people just take the modern form of Jaeon and then just abandon the concept of Jaeon as a Korean aesthetic ideal. That is my main claim. And the next claim will be next unfinished plan is actually I would like to show that how Jaeon works as a conceptual cluster. Jaeon as conceptual cluster, how this Jaeon works in Korean aesthetics in behind the scene. And I would like to apply this concept, explain Jaeon to analyze, or rather than analyze, just illustrate how they are, I think they are kind of actively revisited in contemporary art. Yeah, that's all for today. Sorry for my unfinished talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think at least we are clear about what you are heading for. So I think then maybe we are the next commentator is Sarah Mattis. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, and I want to begin by expressing my gratitude for the invitation to participate. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Dr. Park for suggesting that I comment on her paper. I find her work in Korean aesthetics particularly inspiring. My comments here are organized around a series of about five or more questions for Dr. Park. Although I'm really familiar with Tzuran in its early Taoist and later Chan Buddhist connotations in China, I'm much less familiar with it in the Korean context. So I'm very intrigued by her description of Chaeyeon, maybe somewhere in the ballpark there. Correct my pronunciation, please. By her description of this as both extremely common and perhaps largely misunderstood. So the first two questions that I have are really just kind of genuine personal interest questions, right? Dr. Park mentions that Chaeyeon enters Korea maybe no later than the 9th century, although she suggests that we may see it in quotations from the Lao Tzu, perhaps as early as the 4th century. As she mentions that the project is continuing, I'm really interested in the lineage of the term as it enters in the Korean discourse, whether it's coming kind of primarily from early Taoist texts like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, or also being filtered through Chan or Seon Buddhist materials. And I'm particularly curious about this because of some of the differences I see between the Korean account of Chaeyeon and how I would have described it from the early Taoist material. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Second, Dr. Park mentions that Chaeyeon serves as an important aesthetic ideal for classical music. I think this is just super interesting. So I'm hoping maybe in the larger project, she'll say a little bit more about this. Is it connected with the early Taoist accounts of Tzuran and music? Does it develop its own characteristics? Was it primarily an ideal of the composition, the performance, the listener, some combination? So I'm very excited for her thoughts on that. My third question, Dr. Park discusses several different glosses of Chaeyeon made by earlier, primarily 20th century scholars. But I'm really interested about the various different Korean concepts that also help to structure this term. So as we think about it in English, right, nature, naturalness, really runs the risk of falling into a bunch of different kind of traps. So one being the European romantic notion of nature as the wild, right, that which is opposed to what is ordered, controlled, or rational. And I think in the earlier presentation about the mountains as people, we saw a really fantastic example of why that just doesn't work in this context. We've got another trap in the sort of European trope of nature versus humanity, where nature is understood as the totality of the non-human, or the kind of natural versus artificial, a particularly tricky distinction. But in the early Chinese material, Tzuran functions primarily as adjective or adverb, right, rarely as a noun. And although nature or naturalness are available translations, because they also are sometimes suitable for other terms, like tian, getting a better sense of the related Korean vocabulary, I think would help narrow in on this term. And, from the Chinese, we see translations or parsings such as self-sowing, freely, naturally, cultivated spontaneity, non-oppositional, playful. And so we've got this whole kind of set of related English parsings. And I'm kind of curious how, are all of those also reasonable for Chaeyeon? Or maybe some are better than others, or there's pieces in there that are missing from that early Chinese context. And if I'm following her appropriately, Dr. Park is arguing that Chaeyeon has a stronger connotation of natural in the sense of that which is unforced, or that which unfolds kind of without external imposition of pattern or structure. I'm thinking here in particular of her discussion of the Sokuram Grotto. My fourth question, trying to go quickly here. In the early Chinese materials, Tzuran is both something that's noticed about the world or art objects, but it's really importantly also about people. It's a particularly desirable characteristic or disposition to develop or let flourish. And so it connects the realm of the aesthetic in terms of art with the realm of personal cultivation, right? Living one's life artfully. And I'm curious if this same dynamic also plays out in the Korean context, and if so, whether or not there are distinctively Korean aspects to a recommendation to be more Jaeon, if the grammar works that way. And then my last question is kind of a complicated one. So I just want to preface it here with, as I'm thinking about this question and Dr. Park's paper, I'm thinking about how exciting it is to have aesthetic vocabulary really coming in to kind of world aesthetic consciousness. And so being able to, as she starts in the beginning of her paper, right, really think about the relationship between kind of local aesthetics and our now globalized world, right? So how do we think about Korean beauty, right? Is that something that is only applicable in a Korean context, right? Or do some of these concepts actually have this wider applicability that then enriches the whole of our aesthetic vocabulary? So that's kind of in the background of this question. So I want to end with the part of the paper that I got really excited about. And when she's discussing Go Yusep, Dr. Park highlights the importance of contradictions and embracing contradictions in this concept of Jaeon. I'm really intrigued by this because it seems to me to be somewhat distinct from early Taoist or Zhuangist notions of Tzuran. In the Chinese material, although we sometimes talk about contradictions, in many cases what we're really talking about is more like reverse valuations, right? A case where a common hierarchical dualism, right, strong and weak, is identified and the lesser of the terms is revalued as the greater, right? And in the process of doing that, this reverses the priority and so resists the tendency toward dualistic thinking. But in Dr. Park's account of Jaeon, the contradictions here don't seem to be a reversal. They seem to be a sort of dissonant harmony, kind of holding together of contradictions as they unfold in the work. And I think this is just really interesting. And I'd love to hear more about how she's understanding this. And kind of on this issue of naturalness and contradictions, I'd like to end with an example that I'm thinking about. So in trying to think about how to organize my comments, I wanted to have an instance of Korean art, and I wanted an artifact or something to be thinking about. And I was just unsatisfied with all the examples that came to mind until I started thinking about Blackpink, right, the K-pop band. So I was wondering, right, like, can this more nuanced account of Jaeon that Dr. Park is developing be useful for understanding something as contemporary as K-pop? And I think, I want to be very tentative here, I think the answer is yes, but I'm hoping she'll have more to say about that. You know, although we've got a lot of aspects of contemporary Korean art that are usually discussed under the kind of postmodern rubric of hybridity or syncretism, given Korea's complicated dual colonial past and relationship to the global stage. While these concepts are useful, I think that Jaeon might be better, or maybe relevantly complementary in making sense of this phenomena. So in what sense might we say that Blackpink embodies naturalness? I'm thinking about her discussion of Ko Yusep, where she describes aesthetic experience for him as, quote, a structure that aims for a new synthesis by combining paradoxical or contradictory properties into one. And her discussion of the seeming contradiction presented by the Sokuram Grotto, where she says, quote, therefore, the ideal of perfect proportions and the pursuit of spontaneity, which seems contradictory in language, may not be contradictory in the actual artwork. In fact, I believe, she says, that these conflicts and tensions always occur in real artwork. The work that is made to fit the exactly calculated form is not already a work of art, but a ready-made product, end quote. So bringing to mind the intensely choreographed, yet aesthetically unpredictable performances of a group like Blackpink, the concept of Jaeon seems to help make sense of why what ought to be a jarring and unpleasant combination of things actually ends up working. There is uniformity and uniqueness, conformity and resistance, individual skill, performance of collectivity, right? All of which unfolds with the aesthetic force of an event whose momentum is internal, not external. And as Michael Hurt writes in Considering Korean Pop Art, quote, Korea has simply accepted artifice as part of art forms, or perhaps an art form unto itself, end quote. So I'm thinking about whether or not this is perhaps a contemporary legacy or remnant of this classical aesthetic, Chaeyeon. So I want to thank Dr. Park. This was a really rich paper, and looking forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm not. I'm now convinced that you have been. I mean, you have entered inside of me. I think. Yeah, I'd like to thank you for really helpful and encouraging and really really focused in right way the comments. I'd like to try to answer, and then those actually questions will be properly answered when I finish my paper, I think. But I'd like to try what I'm thinking regarding these questions. I would like to answer to the simple question first. I said that Chaeyeon entered Korea no later than the 8th century, but I mentioned, actually I made the footnote at the Laozi, the text Laozi was entered much earlier on. The reason why I describe this describe in this way is because 9th century we could see the exact use of the term Chaeyeon in the one of the kind of confusion, anyway, Korean scholars whose name is Choi Chi-won. We can see the exact use of Chaeyeon there, but beforehand we don't have. So that's why but we have the quotation of the phrase of Lao Tzu in, I think, 370 BC or not BC, AD, something like that. So I assume that in early Three Kingdom period, Lao Tzu was aware, Lao Tzu was read, even not among the scholars, but because this person who mentioned this Lao Tzu's praise is actually general. So he's not a military person, but he could mention the Lao Tzu's praise. So based on this historical fact, I assume that Lao Tzu was received and entertained before the Buddhism was popular in Korean Peninsula. It is my simple answer. And the second question is, there is also, actually, I was about to include that quotation from, there is the book, it is entitled Akkaklebom. Akkaklebom means musical canon or musical manual or something like that, which was formed in 15th century. And there is, I would like to quote the full, because in the first part of my unfinished second part of the paper, actually, I quote this, so I can just easily, the very, very impressive kind of sentence appear in that book, Akkaklebom, musical canon of Korean music. Music comes out of the heaven, inhabits human being, and complete in Chaeyeon. So there, this Chaeyeon is not just heaven, not just human, something in between, and it is actually presented as an ideal. So this is the first line of the book, preface of that book. So it actually represents how they accepted the concept Chaeyeon at the time, at latest 15th century in Joseon, Korea. And so maybe others, I will say was for other parts. And then the third part, third question, there is also really important in inspiring question. And I have been thinking of what is the contribution of Korean conceptualization of Chaeyeon so far. And then what I wanted to say is there are actually, I'm not saying that Chaeyeon has been always used as a the way I would like to propose, but rather there are kind of variation. That's why I would like to tell you kind of like conceptual spectrum of Zion. The term Zion are quite wide. So, for example, love for natural things also entertained, as we have seen in Dr. Go's paper, right? So they like real natural thing sometimes, but it is a very small part of like the spectrum, conceptual spectrum of Zion. What I mean that I would like to argue for. So sometimes it is used as a perfection. So kind of perfect skillfulness, and it was done without any distinction between nature thing and human-made artificial thing. And then more significant like feature that I found is, as you said, kind of dynamic nature of the I mean conceptual the dynamic concept of Zion. Sometimes Zion means like seeking change constantly. So it is actually presented in many like not just the articulated theories. So they are often want to just grasp like hold these different features and then want to generalize and conceptualize those various endeavor into just one concept. But actually, if you meet the real artist or real musician in person, then we can see they are really pursuing if they are really the real artists or real musicians, they pursue constant change, never ending changing, something like that. So from there we can see, so that's why I think the phrases which in the opposite like dynamic structure are so popular here. Here means Korea, not only traditional Korea, but here in contemporary Korea too. So okay, I think I better to move to the fourth question.
So I think we already passed the time, so maybe
Okay.
you can save the time for the final presentation.
Right, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I will do that.
Unfortunately, I would like to hear your view about the Blackpink. So you can.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I want to ask you, and then I would give you my example, and then I'd like to study from you regarding Blackpink. Okay, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, then the final presenter for today's workshop is Soyeon Park from Sungkyunkwan University. Please welcome Soyeon Park.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to share the contents first. Okay, so can you see? Yeah, okay. Okay, so finally, the last presentation for today. So before start, I like to, I like to say I really appreciate Professor Min Tang for reading my paper. So in my working paper, I focus on the genre of fable and its aesthetic significance in Korean literary history. I think the genre of Korean fable and its unique narrative aesthetics more, deserve more scholarly attention. So what is more interesting is the emergence of the subgenre of fabulous court-case fiction in the late 19th century. So this is a kind of ingenious fusion of animal fables and court case that is crime fiction. So despite the rich Korean fable tradition and the re-emergence of the genre in modern mass media at the modern times, few critics have noted its significance in Korean literary history. So contemporary literary historians such as the Cho Dong-il, so can you see? Okay, I'm sorry. Contemporary literary historians such as Cho Dong-il assert the huge gap between traditional fables and the modern novel. Quote, the fable genre, which failed to deal with the problems of people and society directly, appears only too well as an obstacle to the development of modern novel. There are sufficient reasons for excluding the former, so fable genre in the process of establishment of the latter modern novel, unquote. So, however, the fable genre was never dismissed by modern Korean writers, but on the contrary, reinvented for the masses and utilized for the sake of social criticisms and mass education. For instance, in modern fables, such as the Minutes of Birds and Beasts, 금수회의록 in 1908, and The Trial of Birds and Beasts, 금수재판 in 1910, were published. So in these novels, various species of contentious animals appear for public speeches or court appeals in attempt to deliver political and moral messages and call upon the urgent social reform. These works have been categorized into a new narrative genre representing novel ideas. That is the new novel, 신소설. However, these modern fables might be influenced and facilitated by the rise of a new subgenre of fable in the late 19th century Korea. It is fabulous court case fiction that is the unlikely convergence of the fantastical fable genre and realistic court case fiction. So fabulous court case fiction shows how to tell the truth in narrative without any mechanism of control of imagination, or without any mechanism of picture-like representation of real life and manners, like modern European novel. So this unique subgenre of fable deserves due attention, I think, because it sheds a light on how a wide problem of truth and fiction is dealt with in each different narrative tradition. So what is fable? Fable is, by definition, a type of stories in prose or verse characterized by non-human characters such as animals, plants, and inanimate objects that are anthropomorphized to illustrate a particular moral lesson. So today's fables are often categorized into children's literature, as in, Aesop's fables. But actually, the genre has been also understood as one of the most enduring narrative genres founded on oral storytelling traditions in world literary history. So the ancient Greek fables attributed to Aesop are still widely read among young audiences today. However, the original texts were hardly intended for simple precepts or even for popular entertainment. So they were utilized for rhetoric, and that is why Greek orators and rhetoricians, including Aristotle, collected Aesop's fables for their studies of rhetoric. So as far as the ancient origin of the fable genre is concerned, it is said to have originated from India as well as Africa. In particular, along with the spread of Indian Buddhism, various Indian fables contained in Buddhist sutras were transmitted to East Asia and absorbed into the local storytelling traditions. So Korean fable tradition also influenced by Indian fable tradition a lot. So one of the most prominent examples was Story of a Rabbit, or Tokkijan, aka a story of turtle. Yeah, so in pre-modern Korean literature. So the English term fable is often translated into Weihua or Weiyan, not only in Chinese, but also in Japanese or Korean. So, you know, in Korean pronunciation, it is pronounced Wuhua or Wuon. So, Weihua or Weiyan is now you know, widely used in East Asia without any clear distinction. But Weiyan originally comes from the Zhuangzi, right? So its meaning seems much broader, much broader than that of fable. So in the Chinese literary tradition, Weiyan as a generic term had referred to a wide variety of allegorical narratives, including fables, myths, fantastic tales, historical anecdotes, and even jokes since the Zhuangzi. So distinct from the lack of animal fables in the Chinese literary tradition, various animal fables in both oral and written forms were reproduced and produced and circulated among wide-ranging audiences in pre-modern Korea. So despite the Confucian influences, Korean literary tradition fully developed the genre of animal fables by adapting Indian Buddhist fables, as in Story of Rabbit. So now, yeah, I want to focus more on fabulous court case fiction. So, yeah, it seems that the idea of fiction or fictionality, so in other words, telling a lie, that was so uncomfortable in Confucian literary tradition, was not so problematic in Korean narrative tradition, I think. So fabulous court case fiction depicting the courtrooms of the animal world emerged in the 19th century. So then what factors prompted such unusual fusion of court case fiction and animal fables in the Korean narrative tradition? what we know is only the fact that the wide diffusion of legal culture inspired the rise of a new narrative subgenre that is fabulous court case fiction. So I want to introduce to you, the very unique text, court case of Frog and Snake, Wasaoban. So actually, there are quite a few fabulous court case stories I want to introduce, but I have not enough time for this today. So I'm just mainly focusing on the Wasaoban here. Actually, I already published an article about this text, which has, so my former article has focused on the law and literature perspective rather than aesthetic perspective. But this text is still truly unique and remarkable. So not only in law and literature perspective, but also in aesthetic perspective. And that this text is still not so widely known. That's why I want to talk about this text again today. So in this text, fictional narrative is neatly incorporated into legal writing that is technical and accurate. So the technical aspects of law and legal knowledge seem completely incompatible with imaginative writing. So we can find how unique this text, Wasaoban, is in that, it makes possible the convergence of legal literature and fiction and of fact and fantasy. And it is the only surviving text adopting the inquest record form, common for fiction writing. So inquest records are highly technical legal drafts reporting the result of inquest, comhom. So comhom is the process of investigating unnatural death cases, including both murder and suicide. So I'm not going into the website right now, but this website actually introduces original text, both original text and its Korean translation. So if you are interested in this particular text, probably it's really helpful. So original text and Korean translation both are available at this website. So if you read the original text, you may find the original text written in Idu writing, also known as clerk's writing. So clerk's writing is a mixture of literary Chinese and certain Chinese characters borrowed for particular Korean vernacular fiction, Korean vernacular expressions. So it was widely used in various types of official documents, including legal documents. So even long after the invention of Hangul script in 1443, clerk's writing, despite its complexity in usage, was persistently used for written communications in the public realm, while Hangul, dismissed as female writing, was for limited use within the private realm. I think we should pay more attention to the increased use of clerk's writing for fiction or any other popular genres in the 19th century. So So I want to just talk about the text right now. So the text, Wasaogan, strictly follows the form and style of an inquest record. So in the 19th century fictional narrative text, or commonly used for legal education. In this context, we may assume that the Wasaogan was primarily intended for legal education for general audiences. And the text depicts all the stages of the inquest of a death case, murder case, in order, as you see. And so the story, the main story is like this. So main story begins with the scene that Frog files death report about his son. So his son is Tadpole. So Tadpole, who died shortly after, he was bitten by snake. And then the post-mortem examination of the body, Tadpole's body, reveals that cause of Tadpole's death was snake's venomous bites. 10 odd characters constituting the community. So actually various animal creatures living near the pond, from quail to a fly, one after another, are summoned one by one for testimony. So despite the post-mortem result indicating that a snake is apparently guilty, the offender persistently resists to confess his crime. So, however, the inquest officer never uses torture or even verbal threat to extract a confession from the offender. So instead, he continues the painstaking interrogation procedure by repeatedly questioning the key witnesses until checking every detail of the incident with them. So, and then finally, there's the attached inquest officer's closing statement at the end of the story. So you see, there are all animal characters in the story. Okay, so so it seems very amusing and playful. So all these animal characters. So like main character is frog and snake, and Tadpole was a victim, something like that. Yeah. But actually, the story itself is deadly serious. You can find. So then, what is so important about this story? What is the aesthetic and literary significance of this story? I think we should pay particular attention to the inquest officer character in this story. He is, kind of embodiment of judicial rationality, which is rarely represented in traditional crime fiction, including both Korean and Chinese. The traditional judge is usually embodiment of authoritative judicial power, inexorably punishing evil criminals. In this story, he consistently manages his objective and impartial point of view. So the narrative is completely fictional and fantastic, but at the same time, very objective and accurate with restrained emotionalism. So how should we deal with this blurred boundary between truth and fiction, between reason and fantasy represented in this fable. That's my question I continue to have about this text. So in this way, by blurring the boundary firmly established in modern culture, between truth and fiction, between reason and fantasy, the text, Wasaoban, or the subgenre of fabulous court-case fiction may provide new perspectives on fiction and fictionality, and make us rethink the ethical, social, and cognitive roles imposed on fiction in the Korean narrative tradition. Okay, this is my references. Okay, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And the comments is by Min Tang, but I think she is not here because of time differences. And the comments will be read by Will, and Will is going to help us to read, read her paper, her comments. Thank you.
Okay. Make sure. Good, I'm unmuted. Okay. Yes, this is Dr. Tong's comment paper. Thank you for Professor So-hyun Park's paper. It is extremely interesting and reveals the importance of Korean fiction, especially the uniqueness of the fabulous court case stories. I enjoy the paper and the subject matter very much, and I'm thankful for the opportunity of reading the paper. The following are a few questions that I have. Hopefully they could spark some further conversations about the topic. One, what is the aesthetic and literary significance of the fabulous court case stories? Is it A, the sharp contrast between reality and fantasy, between truth and fiction, and between a serious writing and an entertaining narrative? Or is it B, the exercise of judicial rationality in the fabulous court case story, relying solely on forensic evidence, testimony, and legal reasoning? How is A, the blurry contrast aesthetic or literary? How is B, the exercise of judicial rationality, the aesthetic or literary? Second question is, what contributes to the development of modern enlightenment in modern Korean newspapers? Is the aesthetic and literary significance of the fabulous court case stories making the contribution? Or is it the legal argumentative writing style in those stories making the contribution? How is the legal argumentative writing style aesthetically appealing rather than unappealing? For example, dry like some legal documents. Additionally, with the human-like characters of the animals pursuing truth and justice in those fables, and the conflicts brought by those characters make even more salient contributions to the aesthetic qualities of the fables rather than the argumentative writing style itself. The third question is, what are the differences in terms of aesthetic qualities and significance between a fabulous court case story, for example, A Court Case of Frog and Snake, and some modern animations, for example, the Bee Movie, which also involves a court-related scenario. And then she links a couple scenes to that. And the final question is a quote, and it is, the fable genre that is unable to deal with the people's problems and society directly may be seen as an obstacle to the development of the modern novel. There are sufficient reasons for excluding the former from the process of establishing the latter. The idea above from contemporary historian